Have you ever wondered what happens when justice meets the end of the line? In 2023, 24 convicted killers faced their final moments across America, each story as chilling as it is tragic. From premeditated ambushes to brutal betrayals, their last meals and final words reveal the agony of closure. Subscribe and join us as we unravel these harrowing tales. 1. Amber McLofflin. Amber McLofflin, 49, once known as Scott A. McLofflin, became the first openly transgender woman executed in U.S. history. In April 2003, Amber strangled her ex-fiancé, Beverly Genther, following a violent argument. The crime shocked their rural Missouri community. Amber had been living as Scott when she arrived at Genther's home, and the two engaged in an escalating physical struggle. Reports indicate that Amber admitted to the killing almost immediately and participated in her own defense, citing a troubled childhood, severe gender dysphoria, and a long history of mental health struggles. Despite pleas from LGBTQ advocates and mental health professionals, her appeals were denied at both the state and federal levels. As the lethal injection drugs were administered at Moberly Correctional Center, Amber remained calm, requesting that her family be told she forgave them. She declined a last meal. In her final moments, she said, "I love you all. I'm at peace." Her execution ignited a fierce national debate about mental illness, identity, and the death penalty's application to transgender inmates. 2. Robert Frada. Robert J. Frada, 65, was an ex-Missouri City police officer whose life unraveled into a chilling murder-for-hire plot. In November 1994, Robert hired 2 hitmen to ambush his estranged wife, Farah Frada, in a parking lot outside a Houston grocery store. Farah, aware of divorce proceedings, feared for her life, but could not escape his deadly reach. Investigators uncovered that Robert had funneled life insurance proceeds to pay his co-conspirators, who shot Farah multiple times as she sat at a cash register. The jury heard hours of damning testimony, recorded conversations, witness statements, and evidence of Robert's manipulation. After a swift conviction in 1995, Robert spent nearly 3 decades on death row, filing countless appeals. On the night of his execution at the Huntsville unit, he refused a final meal and issued no apology. His final words were reserved, "Tell my family I love them." At 7:49 p.m., 24 minutes after the lethal injection began, his life ended. The state's revelation that expired drugs would be used in the injections spurred a last-minute stay, but higher courts let the execution proceed, marking Texas's first execution of 2023. 3. Scott Eisenberg. Scott James. Eisenberg, 62, stood condemned for the blunt force murders of A.J. Cantrell and his wife, Patsy Cantrell, in October 2003. Scott had been hired by A.J. to work on the Cantrells' home, but after a dispute over payment, he returned at night, bludgeoning A.J. and Patsy in their own living room. Their bodies lay undiscovered for days. Friends became concerned when the couple missed work, and a neighbor's tip finally led police to the grim scene. Under intense scrutiny, Scott eventually confessed, citing frustration over unpaid wages and an impulsive rage. During the 2004 trial, jurors heard how he covered the bodies with a blanket, ransacked the house, then fled the state before being arrested in California weeks later. He exhausted appeals, arguing mental instability and remorse, but the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board rejected clemency. On January 12th, at Oklahoma State Penitentiary, he declined a last meal and spoke no final words, only shaking his head when asked. At 10:02 p.m., the lethal injection ended his life. Survivors of A.J. and Patsy, 2 pillars of their small town, felt justice served but remained haunted by the senseless brutality of that October night. McQuarter Wesley Ruiz. Wesley Ruiz, 43, was a former Border Patrol agent who snapped during a 2007 ambush of Dallas Police Corporal Mark Nix. On a quiet April evening, Corporal Nix spotted a vehicle weaving dangerously. When he attempted a traffic stop, Wesley, behind the wheel, opened fire, fatally wounding Nix. Investigators later learned Ruiz harbored deep resentment after a personal grievance with law enforcement and blamed the Dallas Police Department for perceived injustices in his family's past. Captured after a high-speed chase, he showed no remorse at the scene, confessing he intended to provoke a deadly confrontation. At trial, Wesley claimed PTSD and crooked investigations fueled his rage. Psychiatrists described a chilling mix of anger and depression, but jurors found him fully responsible for executing Nix in cold blood. Over 16 years, his appeal sought reduced sentences, citing mental health issues and a stable prison record, but courts repeatedly denied relief. On execution day, he declined a final meal, instead requesting a moment of silence for Corporal Nix. As the lethal injection began, Ruiz whispered, "God, forgive me," looking skyward before losing consciousness. His death sparked fierce debate over mental health, service-related trauma, and the limits of justice. 5th Leonard Raheem Taylor. Leonard Raheem Taylor, 58, once a promising college athlete, became notorious for the January 2002 abduction of 6-year-old Angela Rowe and her 3 siblings. Leonard lured the children into his car under the pretense of a game, taking Angela to an abandoned farmhouse. There, he repeatedly stabbed her and left her for dead. 2 of her siblings escaped and alerted authorities. Angela's body was found hours later. In neighboring homes, frantic searches uncovered her siblings, traumatized but physically unharmed. Evidence at trial included Leonard's bloody clothing, his discarded knife, and eyewitness accounts. Overwhelming testimony of forensic experts and the children themselves painted a harrowing portrait of cold-blooded brutality. Leonard's defense cited childhood abuse, mental breakdowns, and an alleged brain injury, but jurors rejected these claims, issuing a death sentence in late 2002. Years of appeals and pleas for clemency focused on his emotional scars and alleged remorse, but Missouri's governor denied reprieves. On the evening of February 7th, the lethal injection took place at Monte Correctional Center. Leonard's final words were a brief apology to Angela's family and a request for their forgiveness. He had no last meal, only a sip of water. His execution underscored the emotional toll on victims' families and reopened debates about youthful trauma and the death penalty's moral obligations. 6. John Ballentine. John Nelson Ballentine, 54, terrorized Amarillo in June 1994, fatally gunning down 3 teens, 14-year-old Gustavo Almaraz, 18-year-old Richard Johnston, and 15-year-old Mark Armendariz, during a neighborhood drug deal gone wrong. Under the influence of methamphetamine, John had arranged to buy cocaine, but when the transaction soured, he shot each victim execution-style before fleeing. Panicked neighbors discovered the teens' bodies strewn across a deserted street. Crime scene photos captured overturned bicycles, shattered glass, and pools of blood. Ballentine was arrested days later after police traced shell casings to his stolen vehicle, and he confessed following an exhaustive interrogation. At trial, prosecutors described the senseless carnage. Witnesses testified to John's erratic behavior in the preceding weeks. Despite claims of addiction, PTSD from military service, and remorse, the jury sentenced him to die. Appeals argued ineffective counsel and flawed forensic testimony, but higher courts upheld the verdict. At 6:01 p.m. on February 8th, John entered the Huntsville unit, declined a last meal, and offered no final statement. As the drugs coursed through his veins, he stared blankly at the ceiling until his breathing ceased. The Amarillo community mourned 3 vibrant young lives extinguished, and their families found grim closure in his execution. 7. Donald Dilbeck. Donald Dean. Dilbeck, 59, earned the grim nickname Ninja Killer. In April 1988, Donald robbed a convenience store in Tallahassee and then brutally murdered a 34-year-old nurse, Pamela Lynn Riley, brutally stabbing her 25 times when she tried to intervene. Over the next 2 decades, Donald's life in prison scarcely improved. He traumatized fellow inmates and guards, requiring solitary confinement for decades. His final crime came behind bars in 1994. During a library visit, he strangled an elderly inmate, doubling his death sentence. As the February cold wind whipped across Florida State Prison, Donald's mental state deteriorated further. Despite multiple appeals citing severe brain damage from childhood malnutrition and alleged psychosis, courts found no compelling reason to stay execution. On execution night, he requested only a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a Coke, consuming them in silence. At 7 p.m., surrounded by guards, Donald leaned back as lethal drugs flowed. After a short struggle, he slumped motionless. His final words, whispered in a raspy voice, were, "It's over." Witnesses noted tears in his eyes. News of his death prompted heavy criticism from mental health advocates who decried Florida's handling of a man many claimed was perpetually broken. 8. Gary Green. Gary Green, 51, became infamous in September 2009 when he stalked his estranged wife, Lavetta Armstead, to her Dallas home, where he fatally stabbed her 32 times. After coldly plunging a knife into Lavetta, he dragged her lifeless 6-year-old daughter, Jasmine Montgomery, into the bathtub and drowned her. Jasmine's bloodied body was found floating the next morning. Lavetta's remains lay concealed under a blanket. Gary fled to Mississippi, only to be arrested a week later when a tip revealed his location. At trial, prosecutors displayed crime scene photos that left the courtroom speechless. Forensic psychologists testified that his rage was driven by rejection. Gary insisted he didn't mean to kill Jasmine, but the jury saw no mitigating evidence. He was sentenced to death in 2010. Over 14 years, he filed endless appeals on grounds of intellectual disability and mental illness, but judges ruled his crimes demonstrated chilling intent. On March 7th, as the sun set, Gary requested a simple plate of pepperoni pizza for his last meal, eating it slowly. Called for final words, he said only, "I'm sorry to everyone I hurt." Beneath blinking prison lights, he received lethal injection. He twisted, gasped, then lay still, his execution closing a chapter of unimaginable horror for Dallas residents. 9. Arthur Brown, Jr. Arthur Squirt. Brown, Jr., 52, spent 31 years on death row for the June 1992 Brownstone Lane murders in Houston. On that sweltering summer night, Brown, Marion Dudley, and Antonia Tony Dunson burst into a southwest Houston home during a drug deal. They tied up 6 people, then shot 4 victims execution style: Jose Tovar, his wife's 17-year-old son Frank Farias, 19-year-old pregnant Jessica Quinones, and 21-year-old Audrey Brown. Miraculously, Rachel Tovar and 1 other survived, later identifying Brown as the shooter. Evidence tied Brown to a larger drug ring trafficking cocaine. Despite his pleas of innocence, claiming prosecutors suppressed evidence, courts upheld his conviction. A surviving victim and Tovar's family lodged emotional testimonies during clemency hearings, demanding justice after decades of grief. On the evening of March 9th at the Huntsville unit, Brown read a prepared statement proclaiming innocence, lamenting that the state was executing an innocent man. He vowed to haunt those courts that denied him. As the lethal drugs began, Brown strained against his restraints, gasping for breath. He whispered, "God forgive me," then fell silent. In those final minutes, a palpable tension gripped the chamber, his death echoing the 4 brutal murders he steadfastly denied. 10. Michael Dwayne Zac III. Michael Dwayne Zac III, 54, earned the grim moniker Ninja Killer after murdering 2 women he met at Florida Panhandle beach bars in June 1996. First, on Okaloosa Island, he strangled 26-year-old Lori Rosillo, leaving her body hidden among dunes. Barely 24 hours later, Michael targeted 22-year-old Ravon Smith at Pensacola Beach, luring her into her own home before sexually assaulting and stabbing her repeatedly. Police arrested him on June 15th. In custody, Michael confessed without remorse, saying he felt invincible. During trial, pathologists testified to severe ligature marks on both victims, and ballistic evidence confirmed his rapid escalation. A jury swiftly condemned him to death. Over 2 decades, he steadfastly insisted mental health issues, fetal alcohol syndrome, and childhood trauma diminished his culpability. Appeals advanced to the Florida Supreme Court, which finally declined intervention. On April 12th, at Florida State Prison, Michael refused a last meal, spending his final hours in quiet reflection. At 6:14 p.m., after a lethal dose of pentobarbital coursed through his veins, he said, "I love you all," referring to his wife and spiritual advisor. His pronouncement of "Tell my family I love them" lingered as the gurney, empty of life, was wheeled away, closing a chapter of cold-blooded, recreational killing. 11th, Daryl Barwick. Daryl Raymond Barwick, 56, committed a savage crime on March 15, 1986, in a small Florida Panhandle apartment. A neighbor heard an agonizing scream, then silence. Inside, investigators found 21-year-old Rebecca Guilford, her throat slit, body covered in defensive wounds. Forensics revealed Daryl had broken in, beaten her unconscious, then stabbed her 37 times. His apartment, just 2 blocks away, still bore bloodstains and the knife, discarded in a wastebasket. Barwick fled to Alabama, briefly changing his identity before authorities tracked his fingerprints after an unrelated arrest. At trial, his defense team argued insanity, highlighting his long history of abuse and substance addiction. Psychiatrists diagnosed a severe antisocial personality disorder. Rebecca's family, now grieving a daughter and sister, visited court daily, their faces etched with anguish. The jury convicted him in 1987. His appeals spanned decades, citing flawed jury instructions, but courts found no reversible error. On May 3rd, standing before a white, sterile gurney, Daryl chose only a glass of water as his last meal. Pressed for final words, he said, "I'm sorry it had to be this way. God bless." 4 minutes later, his chest rose once more, then fell. Life extinguished as Florida continued its inexorable carryout of capital punishment. 12th, Johnny Johnson. Johnny Allen Johnson, 45, abducted and murdered 6-year-old Casey Williamson on July 26, 2002, in suburban Valley Park, Missouri. Casey had been playing in front of her home when Johnny, a family friend, invited her into his truck under the guise of buying candy. Instead, he drove to an abandoned glass factory where he attempted to rape her. Casey resisted fiercely, prompting Johnny to bludgeon her with a brick, then a large rock, inflicting fatal head trauma. Hours later, Casey's body, brutalized and bloodied, was discovered by a fisherman near Lake Stanley Draper. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Johnny after uncovering his footprints at the crime scene and matching fibers from Casey's clothing to his truck. At the 2005 trial, Casey's father described rushing to identify his daughter's remains, his grief palpable in every courtroom corner. Johnny's lawyers argued severe mental illness, schizophrenia, drove his actions, but Missouri's Supreme Court rejected pleas to spare him. Over years of last-minute appeals, he remained composed on death row, expressing contrition only in sporadic letters. On June 1st, as the execution warrant was read, Johnny declined a formal last meal, instead requesting a glass of water. At 6:33 p.m., the lethal injection began. In a whisper, he uttered, "God bless. I'm sorry to the people and family I hurt." Casey's father, standing behind witness glass, wept softly, as Johnny's life, once so full of promise, was irrevocably extinguished. 13. Dwayne Owen, Dwayne Ray. Owen, 62, earned notoriety in 1987 for the June slayings of a babysitter, 20-year-old Sarah D., and her employer, 39-year-old Martha Slattery. That afternoon, Dwayne slipped into the Slattery home in West Palm Beach, guns drawn. When Sarah tried to escape with the children, Dwayne shot her point blank. Martha rushed in upon discovering her daughter missing. Dwayne shot her too. Their car, with Sarah's body slumped against the steering wheel, was found parked near a highway exit 2 days later. Dwayne fled to Atlanta, where fingerprints and an eyewitness place him at the scene. Prosecutors proved Dwayne intended to steal valuables, escalating to violence when confronted. At trial, Dwayne said he blamed his drug addiction and ritual violence for his actions. He derided the jury's hearing of his childhood abuse, insisting he was merely trying to survive. The jury found him guilty on each capital count, rejecting mental health defenses. On June 15th, in the sterile Florida State Prison chamber, Dwayne asked only for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He spent his final moments whispering the names of his own children. As lethal chemicals flowed, he slid into silence and ceased breathing. Witnesses say his execution was the quietest of the year in Florida. Yet, for the victims' families, the echoes of that June afternoon remained thunderous. 14th, Jermaine Monte Cannon. Jermaine Monte Cannon, 51, once a model inmate after escaping a prison work camp, returned to commit a horrifying crime. On August 3, 1995, Jermaine broke into the Tulsa home of Sharonda White Clark and stabbed her repeatedly with a butcher knife until she bled out on her living room floor. The crux? Jermaine believed Sharonda was responsible for his return to bus duty following his escape. Investigators tracked Jermaine's blood-stained clothes to a dumpster. His footprints at the scene matched his boot treads. He surrendered without resistance, famously stating, "I wanted to fight for my freedom, but I found death instead." At trial, the victim's family described Sharonda as a beloved mother and teacher's aide. Their grief permeated every day of testimony. Jermaine's lawyers tried to show his environment: violent upbringing, brief parole, then imprisonment. Ultimately triggered a psychotic break. Jurors disagreed. After surviving 28 years of appeals, his date was set. On July 20th, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, he ordered fried fish and baked beans but left most untouched. His final statement read slowly, asked for forgiveness from heaven, but offered no apology to Sharonda's family. He closed, "May God have mercy." At 10 a.m., the lethal injection began. Jermaine wept as the anesthesia took effect. By 10:12 a.m., he was pronounced dead, leaving Sharonda's son to say only, "She finally sleeps peacefully." 15. James Edward Barber. James Edward Barber, 64, claimed his memory of June 2001 was hazy, but evidence painted a brutal truth. He violently invaded 75-year-old Dorothy Epps's Huntsville home under the influence of crack cocaine and prescription painkillers. Dorothy, hearing footsteps in her dining room, found herself face-to-face with James, an ex-boyfriend of her daughter who had done repair work on her house. Witnesses later testified James beat Dorothy mercilessly with a metal pipe. Neighbors' screams alerted authorities, but rescue arrived too late. Dorothy died from multiple blunt force injuries. During trial, James's attorneys highlighted a history of substance abuse and mental instability, but jurors saw a calculated killing. They sentenced him to death in late 2003. Years of stays and appeals focused on Alabama's troubled history of botched executions. James's own execution was delayed 3 times, as technicians unable to establish live lines. On July 21st, the 4th scheduled attempt succeeded, after nearly 2 hours of struggling by the execution team. James's final meal request, a turkey sandwich, remained untouched. His final words delivered in a weak voice, "I love you, Mom." He then asked for forgiveness. When the nitrogen gas began flowing, his body convulsed violently, gasping as if suffocating before falling limp. Witnesses described the scene as haunting, justice, but at a terrifying cost. 16. Anthony Castillo Sanchez. Anthony Castillo Sanchez, 44, was convicted for the September 24, 1996, abduction, rape, and execution-style murder of 21-year-old University of Oklahoma dance student Julie Buskin. Julie disappeared after failing to show up for her scheduled rehearsal. 10 days later, her body, bound and shot, washed ashore at Lake Stanley Draper. DNA later linked Anthony, already serving a burglary sentence, to semen found on the crime scene. In 2006, despite his persistent claims that his father was the true killer, DNA and shoe print evidence sealed his fate. During the 2006 trial, the victim's grieving parents and friends described Julie's final joyful texts, later twisted into a nightmare. Anthony's defense centered on questionable hypnosis-like testimony from siblings, but failed to cast reasonable doubt. Death was automatic under Oklahoma law for such crimes. Over 27 years on death row, he refused to plead for mercy, insisting innocence. On the morning of September 21st, he ordered a hearty spread: chicken fried steak, fried okra, mashed potatoes with gravy, a roll, sweet iced tea, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. As lethal injections began, Anthony gazed at witnesses yelling, "I'm innocent," then fell silent. At 10:19 a.m., he was pronounced dead. His execution stirred debate about DNA reliability, wrongful convictions, and the long arc of justice. 17. Philip Dean Hancock. Philip Dean Hancock, 59, was the final person executed in the U.S. in 2023 for the January 2001 ambush and killings of James Vincent Lynch III and Robert Lee Jett Jr. in Oklahoma City. The victims, childhood friends, stopped at a convenience store when Philip approached, demanding cash. When James refused, Philip opened fire, killing both. Their bodies lay in a pool of spilled soda. Evidence included ballistic matches to Philip's pistol, phone records showing he'd lured the men under false pretenses, and a bloody confession hours later. His trial exposed a web of gang affiliations and paranoia. Despite his appeals arguing self-defense, claiming Lynch was armed, witnesses corroborated Philip's cold-blooded intent. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board recommended clemency, but Governor Stitt declined, citing brutal cruelty. On November 30th, at McAllister's death chamber, Philip requested 3 cheeseburgers, onion rings, and a chocolate milkshake. He ate in solemn silence. In his final statement, he thanked his legal team and said, "I want my case to be remembered." At 11:29 a.m., he received lethal injection. His last tremors signified a body-resisting death. Witnesses noted tears from one of his lawyers. His execution closed 2023's tally at 24, igniting critics who argued that governors too often ignore parole board recommendations. 18. Brent Ray Brewer. Brent Ray Brewer, 53, spent 33 years in the Amarillo unit for the April 1990 robbery and murder of 66-year-old Robert Laminack. Brent, then 17, confessed to entering Robert's home, planning to steal his car and stabbing him multiple times. At trial, the jury heard testimony from a discredited psychiatrist whose predictions of future dangerousness formed the basis of Brent's death sentence. Defense experts later debunked the psychiatry, arguing his IQ and youth made him unsuited for execution. Appeals ensued for decades, with supporters citing a flawed trial and calls from national groups to spare a mentally impaired youth. Judges, however, upheld his death warrant. On November 9th, in Huntsville, Brent asked for no last meal but did choose to speak. "I hope you find peace," he said to the Laminack family through an interpreter. He then offered a silent prayer. At 6:39 p.m., pentobarbital coursed through his veins. His breathing slowly ceased as his body relaxed. Witnesses described a peaceful passing. His execution became a flashpoint in Texas's ongoing debate over juvenile sentencing, mental health, and junk science in capital cases. 19th. Jedodiah Murphy. Jedodiah Michael Murphy, 48, murdered 79-year-old Bertie Lee Cunningham during an October 2000 carjacking in Garland, Texas. Bertie, returning home from church, was ambushed at gunpoint. Murphy shot him in the head. Surveillance cameras captured the crime. When arrested, Murphy calmly confessed, telling officers he needed cash for drugs. At trial, he admitted guilt, saying he felt no remorse until seeing Bertie's empty wheelchair in court. His lawyers argued he was intellectually disabled and questioned the lethal injection drug's constitutionality. As his execution neared, Murphy challenged Texas's drug protocol, arguing pentobarbital was untested and could violate the Eighth Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court vacated his stay, and on October 10, 2023, he entered the Huntsville unit, requesting mashed potatoes, gravy, and fried chicken as his last meal. He added a prayer of forgiveness for Bertie's family. At 6:45 p.m., injection began. Murphy gasped, then slowly slumped unconscious, his breathing ceasing at 6:52 p.m. His demise reignited criticism of Texas's secrecy around execution drugs and the broader ethics of capital punishment. 20th. Casey A. McQuarter. Casey A. McQuarter, 49, was convicted for plotting with two teens to rob and murder 46-year-old Edward Lee Williams during a 1993 Marshall County robbery. The night of April 11, 1993, Casey and accomplice forced entry into Williams' home, wearing homemade silencers on their rifles. A violent struggle ensued, and Edward was shot 11 times by the teen accomplice. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured Casey and the 16-year-old fleeing in a pickup truck. The jury heard how Casey, then 18, indoctrinated the younger teens, teaching them to fashion silencer parts. Witnesses testified about Casey's boastful threats prior to the crime. His defense painted him as a misguided youth with no violent history, but prosecutors revealed a prior felony and traces of psychopathy. Appeals citing a juror's undisclosed information about her father's murder were rejected. On November 16th, at Holman Correctional Facility, Casey declined a final meal but asked for a dry turkey sandwich. His final words, "I'm sorry to the families, before he offered a brief plea for forgiveness. At 6:56 p.m., death arrived via lethal injection. As lights dimmed, Edward's son murmured, "He finally paid for my dad's life." 21st, Ivan Cantu. Ivan Sergio Cantu, 53, spoke no last words when the lethal injection took his life for the October 4th, 2000, murders of his cousin, James Diaz Mosqueda, and James's girlfriend, Amy Kitchen, in Dallas. That evening, Ivan, fueled by a drug-financed grudge, tracked the couple to Mosqueda's home. He knocked at the door, then opened fire when James answered. Witnesses recounted Amy's screams. Ivan shot her while dragging James outside, gunning him down on the driveway. The Houston Chronicle reported that Ivan openly bragged about cocaine-tinged rage driving him to slaughter anyone who looked at me wrong. Harris County detectives matched shell casings to his stolen pistol, and a ballistics expert linked bullets to that gun. At trial, defense attorneys pointed to Ivan's history of abandonment and untreated PTSD, but jurors saw cold-blooded murder for hire. During 2 decades of appeals, Ivan recanted some confessions but never denied the killings. On November 9th, he chose a roast beef sandwich and fries as his last meal, but ate only a few bites. He declined a final statement when asked. As pentobarbital coursed through his veins, he stared blankly at the ceiling. By 8:31 p.m., flatline, leaving relatives of James and Amy to mourn 2 vibrant young lives abruptly ended. 22nd. Louis Bernard Gaskan. Louis Bernard Gaskan, infamously dubbed the Ninja Killer, haunted Palm Coast on December 20th, 1989, when he crept into the winter home of Robert and Georgette Sturmfels, dressed entirely in black so no one would recognize him. In a flash, he fatally shot the couple with a .22 caliber rifle, then fled, leaving investigators scrambling through a maze of dark, outfitted footprints. Days later, Gaskan's hurried arrest on December 30th revealed not only proof of the Sturmfels murders, property from their home stashed in his Palm Harbor apartment, but also his confession to a 1986 slaying of Charles Martin Miller. During his July 1990 trial, the jury listened to chilling, tape-recorded admissions of random urges to kill and saw forensic matches tying stolen Sturmfels possessions to Gaskan's lair. Despite appeals arguing mental instability, he received 2 death sentences that stood unbroken. On the evening of April 12, 2023, at Florida State Prison, he declined a spiritual advisor but requested one final banquet: barbecue pork ribs, buffalo wings, turkey neck, shrimp fried rice, and French fries. As the lethal drugs coursed through his veins, Gaskan offered a final, defiant statement. "Justice is not about the crime. It's not about vengeance." 20 minutes later, at 6:15 p.m., he was pronounced dead. A man who claimed to seek peace even as he created lasting terror. 23rd, Michael Andrew Tish. On June 22, 2000, a desperate, booze-fueled Michael Andrew Tish and his accomplice, Tracy Bulington, barged into Randolph County Jail in Huntsville, aiming to spring a jailed friend. Instead, Tish opened fire on unarmed jailers, Leon Eagley and Jason Acton, killing both nearly instantly. Panic erupted in the tiny lobby as bullets tore through uniforms. Tish and Bulington fled, but within hours, Missouri and Kansas officers cornered them in Wathena, Kansas. At trial in early 2001, prosecutors presented ballistic evidence matching Tish's stolen Glock to the scene, eyewitness accounts of his cold-blooded shots, and a hacked jail phone recording of the escape plan. Tish claimed he only wanted to lock the jailers up and free inmates, an explanation the jury refused to accept. In June 2023, Missouri's Pardon and Parole Board's rare clemency recommendation was overridden by Governor Mike Parson. On June 6th, Tish requested a feast of 2 bacon cheeseburgers, curly fries, regular fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Quiet until the end, he ate with trembling hands, then offered a brief written statement. "I tried hard to become a better man. I'm sorry for the pain I caused." At 6:10 p.m., the pentobarbital drip began. Witnesses heard his final gulps of air, and by 6:25 p.m., his last heartbeat had stilled, closing the book on a crime that shattered 2 families and left a community stunned.